"Who is singing in my study?" The voice came from the doorway, sharp and commanding. "This house needs to stay quiet. Do you understand?" Nina turned around. For a moment, the world inside the room seemed to shrink. The dust cloth in Nina's hand slipped slightly as she stared at him. Adrian stared back as if someone had struck him without warning. His lips parted, but the words struggled to form. "Nina." His gray eyes moved across Nina's face as if he were trying to confirm she was real. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. The question came out sharper than intended. "Why are you in my house?" "I didn't know this was your house," she said. Adrian frowned. "You didn't know?" "No." She lifted the cloth slightly as if to explain. "I'm just working." Adrian blinked slowly. "Working?" "Yes." He glanced around the room, the ladder near the shelf, the cleaning cloth, the half-dusted books. "This is your job?" he asked. "Yes." "How long have you been working here?" Nina shook her head. "I haven't." Adrian narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means today is my first day." Adrian stared at her. "First day?" "Yes." "Who hired you?" "Mr. Wallace." Adrian's expression hardened instantly. He turned toward the hallway. "Wallace!" His voice echoed through the house. Footsteps approached a moment later. Mr. Wallace appeared in the doorway, calm as always. "Yes, sir." Adrian pointed toward Nina. "You hired her?" Wallace nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You hired someone to work in my house without telling me?" Wallace remained composed. "I believed it was necessary." "Necessary?" Adrian stepped forward. "Wallace, you've worked here long enough to understand something very simple." The room grew tense. "This house belongs to me." "Yes, sir." "Then why?" Adrian continued, his voice sharper now. "Did you hire someone without informing me first?" Wallace answered calmly. "You mentioned last week the house needed help. I interviewed her personally. She seemed reliable." Adrian shook his head. "That's not the point." His tone grew colder. "You've been the manager of this house for years. But that doesn't mean you get to make decisions like you're the owner." Wallace lowered his head slightly. "I apologize if I overstepped." Before Adrian could respond, Nina suddenly stepped forward. Her voice interrupted the tension. "If I'm causing a problem, I can leave." Both men turned toward her. Nina held the cloth in both hands, trying to remain calm. "I didn't know whose house this was," she said quietly. "Mr. Wallace offered the job and I accepted. If my presence is disturbing you, I can go." She took a small breath. "I'm sorry." Adrian looked down briefly, as if thinking. Then he shook his head. "No." Nina blinked. "No?" she repeated softly. "You're already here." His voice regained its calm authority. "You came to work." "Yes." "Then work." Nina hesitated, surprised by the decision. "Are you sure?" Adrian nodded once. "Yes." The answer was simple, but his eyes held something more complicated. Wallace glanced between them quietly. Adrian turned back toward him. "Next time you hire someone, you tell me first." "Yes, sir." Adrian paused before leaving the room. "And Wallace," he added firmly, "don't make me feel like a guest in my own house again." "Yes, sir." Adrian walked out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing across the wooden floor as he headed toward the staircase. Nina slowly returned to the bookshelf and picked up the cloth. Her hands trembled slightly now. Wallace watched her for a moment before speaking gently. "I didn't realize you knew Mr. Russo." Nina kept her eyes on the shelf. "Neither did I," she said softly. Wallace nodded and left the room. The house returned to its usual silence. But somewhere down the long hallway, Adrian Russo stopped walking. Adrian Russo did not return to his study immediately. Instead, he stopped halfway down the hallway, his hand resting against the polished wooden railing of the staircase. The house had returned to its usual silence, but inside his chest something restless had begun moving again. Adrian turned and walked toward the kitchen. The kitchen of the Russo estate was large and bright, built more like the workspace of a professional chef than the private kitchen of a single man. "Mr." Wallace was standing near the counter preparing tea when Adrian entered. The older man glanced up. "Would you like coffee, sir?" Adrian ignored the question. "How long have you known her?" Wallace paused. "I beg your pardon." Adrian walked farther into the room. "The woman you hired." Wallace studied Adrian's expression carefully. "Her name is Nina Walker." "I know her name." Adrian's voice was calm, but there was something sharp beneath it. "How long have you known her?" Wallace placed the teapot down slowly. I interviewed her 2 days ago. That's it? Yes. Adrian narrowed his eyes slightly. And you didn't think to mention that she might already know me? Wallace tilted his head. I didn't realize she did. Adrian let out a quiet breath and walked toward the window. Outside, the garden stretched across several acres of carefully maintained lawn and trees. A groundskeeper was trimming hedges near the fence. Everything looked peaceful. It was almost ironic. You really had no idea? Adrian asked. No. Wallace's voice remained steady. She never mentioned your name. Adrian rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. And she didn't react when you told her where she'd be working? I never told her the owner's name, Wallace admitted. Adrian turned to look at him again. Why not? Wallace shrugged lightly. You've always preferred privacy. That answer irritated Adrian slightly because it was true. For years, he had made sure that most employees working inside the estate had minimal information about him. Fewer questions meant fewer complications. Yet somehow that rule had now brought Nina Walker into his house. Adrian leaned one shoulder against the counter. What do you know about her? Wallace folded his hands together calmly. She lives in Queens. How old? 29. Adrian nodded slowly. That sounded right. Family? One child. Adrian's eyes flickered briefly. A son. How old? 8. The number hung in the air for a moment. Adrian's expression did not change. But something inside him paused long enough to take notice. Does she have a husband? He asked. No. Boyfriend? Not that she mentioned. Adrian looked down at the floor briefly before speaking again. And you're certain she came here just looking for work? Yes. Wallace studied him for a moment. You seem concerned. Adrian gave a quiet, humorless laugh. You'd be concerned too if someone from your past walked into your house without warning. That depends on the past. Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he straightened and picked up the coffee pot himself. He poured a fresh cup and took a slow sip. The bitterness grounded him slightly. Did she say anything about leaving? Wallace asked. Adrian looked at him over the rim of the cup. She offered. And I told her to stay. Wallace nodded once, as if that answer made sense. The older man moved toward the sink and rinsed the teacup he had been holding earlier. After a moment, he spoke again. She seemed nervous when you walked in. Adrian said nothing. Wallace continued. Most people are nervous around you. That's not surprising. But this felt different. Adrian set the cup down. What do you mean? Wallace dried the cup slowly with a towel. It looked like she already knew you. Adrian looked away toward the window again. She did. Wallace waited. Adrian rarely volunteered details about his personal life, and Wallace had learned long ago not to push too hard. Still, curiosity slipped through. You knew her before? Adrian hesitated. Yes. How long ago? 10 years. Wallace nodded thoughtfully. That would explain the shock. Adrian ran a hand through his hair. What I don't understand, he said quietly, is how she ended up here. Sometimes people just need work. Adrian looked back at him. Or sometimes they come looking for something. Wallace did not argue. The two men stood in silence for a moment. Finally, Adrian picked up his coffee again and finished it. Where is she now? In the study. Still cleaning? Yes. Adrian nodded slowly. For a brief moment, he considered walking back there immediately. Then he changed his mind. Let her finish. Yes, sir. Adrian turned toward the door. As he reached it, Wallace spoke again. One more thing. Adrian stopped. Yes? She has a very good singing voice. Adrian looked at him with mild irritation. I noticed. Wallace smiled faintly. It's been a long time since anyone sang in this house. Adrian said nothing. He walked back down the hallway toward his office. But this time the silence inside the Russo estate felt different. Not peaceful, not controlled. Just before reaching his study, Adrian paused again. Through the half-open door, he could see Nina standing on the small ladder beside the bookshelf, carefully dusting the top row. She had returned to work exactly as he had told her. Quiet, focused, professional, as if the past they shared had never existed. Adrian watched her for a few seconds before stepping away again. For 10 years, he had believed that part of his life was finished. Now it was standing inside his house holding a dust cloth. If this story moved you, take a moment and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Your messages mean a lot to this community. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Your support truly keeps these stories alive. Nina continued working in the study long after Adrian had walked away earlier. The large room was quiet again, filled only with the soft sound of cloth moving across wood and glass. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor, drifting slowly toward the tall windows that overlooked the back garden of the estate. She tried to focus on the work, dust the shelves, wipe the desk edges, clean the glass frames. Simple tasks, predictable tasks, yet her thoughts refused to stay quiet. Seeing Adrian again had stirred memories she had spent years locking away. The sound of his voice, the way he stood in the doorway earlier, stunned, almost unable to speak. 10 years. She had imagined many times what it might feel like to see him again, but never like this. Never in his house. Never while holding a cleaning cloth. Nina stepped onto the small ladder beside the tall bookshelf and reached the upper shelf. The books were arranged neatly in rows: business reports, legal volumes, biographies of famous industrialists. She dusted each spine carefully. As she finished the top row, she heard footsteps again in the hallway. Slow, measured. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Adrian Russo appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, watching quietly. Nina climbed down from the ladder and turned toward him. Neither of them spoke at first. Adrian's eyes moved briefly around the room, noticing the shelves she had already finished, the polished desk, the neatly arranged documents. "You work fast," he said. "I'm used to it." Nina picked up the cloth again and wiped the edge of the bookshelf. Adrian walked farther into the room. "I didn't mean to interrupt earlier," he said. "It's all right." He rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair near his desk, pretending to look at a stack of papers as if he had come for something specific. In truth, he had come back because questions had begun forming in his mind. Questions he wasn't sure he should ask. He decided to ask them anyway. "How far do you live from here?" he said casually. Nina glanced at him briefly. "Queens. That's a long commute." "It's manageable." "How do you get here?" "The train." Adrian nodded slowly. "Every day?" "Yes." "That must take time." "About 40 minutes. Adrian leaned against the desk slightly, crossing his arms. "You leave early then?" "I usually do." He paused as if thinking. "Doesn't that make the job difficult?" Nina shrugged lightly. "Most jobs are difficult." Adrian watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You worked somewhere else before this?" "A grocery store." "Stocking shelves?" "Yes." Adrian nodded. "That sounds harder than cleaning a house." "It depends on the day." A small silence followed. Adrian looked toward the window, pretending to study the garden outside. Then he asked another question. "Wallace mentioned something earlier." Nina continued wiping the shelf but slowed slightly. "What did he mention?" "That you have a son." She stopped for a brief second, then resumed cleaning. "Yes." Adrian kept his voice neutral. "How old is he?" 8. He nodded slowly. "School age?" "Yes." "Who watches him while you're working?" "My neighbor usually helps after school." Adrian studied her face carefully. "That must be difficult." "It works." "You manage everything yourself?" "Yes." Another silence followed. Adrian shifted his weight slightly, still leaning against the desk. "What's his name?" Nina hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "Lucas." Adrian repeated it quietly. "Lucas." The name settled somewhere deep in his mind. "Does he like school?" "Most days." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds about right." Nina returned the cloth to the shelf and moved toward the cabinet near the wall. Adrian watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You must have a busy schedule." "I manage." "You always were good at managing things." The comment slipped out before he could stop it. Nina paused. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her expression remained calm. "That was a long time ago." "Yes." Adrian straightened from the desk. "I suppose it was." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The quiet in the room felt different now, not tense exactly, but filled with things left unsaid. Adrian glanced toward the small ladder beside the shelf. "You shouldn't climb that alone in some of the higher rooms," he said. "I'll be careful. If you need help, Wallace can assist." "I will." Adrian nodded once. He had asked what he wanted to ask, or at least part of it, but the most important question still sat in the back of his mind. He didn't ask it. Not yet. Instead, he walked slowly toward the doorway. Before leaving, he spoke again. "Lunch is usually around 1. I know. Wallace will show you the kitchen." "Okay." Adrian paused briefly in the doorway and glanced back at her. Nina had already returned to her work, wiping the cabinet with quiet concentration, as if their conversation had been nothing more than a normal exchange between employer and employee. Adrian stepped into the hallway. But as he walked away, one thought stayed with him. 8 years old, Lucas. The number turned over slowly in his mind, and for the first time since Nina Walker had walked into his house that morning, Adrian Russo began to feel something he had not felt in many years. Adrian Russo did not go back to work immediately after leaving the study. Instead, he walked slowly through the quiet hallway toward the back terrace of the house. The glass doors opened onto a wide stone patio overlooking the garden. Late afternoon sunlight had begun stretching long shadows across the lawn, and the cool breeze from the water carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. Adrian stepped outside and rested his hands on the railing. 8 years old, Lucas. The number continued to move quietly through his mind like a puzzle piece that refused to sit still. He told himself the thought meant nothing. Plenty of women had children. Plenty of lives had moved forward in the 10 years since he had last seen Nina. Still, the timing sat too close to his memory. He exhaled slowly and tried to push the idea aside. Behind him, the sliding door opened. Mr. Wallace stepped onto the terrace carrying a small tray with a coffee cup. "I thought you might want another one," Wallace said. Adrian didn't turn. "Leave it there." Wallace placed the cup on the small iron table beside him. For a moment the older man stood quietly, watching the same distant view Adrian was staring at. The garden workers had finished trimming the hedges, and the estate had returned to its usual peaceful appearance. Yet Wallace had worked in this house long enough to recognize when something had shifted. "You seem distracted," he said gently. Adrian let out a quiet breath. "That obvious?" "Yes." Adrian finally turned and picked up the coffee. "You remember when you told me this morning that ghosts don't stay buried?" Wallace nodded slightly. "Yes, you were right." Wallace didn't respond immediately. He simply waited. After a moment, Adrian spoke again. "She has a son." "Yes." 8 years old. Wallace watched him carefully. "Yes." Adrian took a slow sip of the coffee. "You didn't think that was worth mentioning earlier?" Wallace tilted his head slightly. "I didn't know it would matter." Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. "I didn't either." The two men stood in silence for a moment. Then Wallace spoke again. "She works hard." Adrian nodded. "I noticed. Most people would have left after the conversation earlier." Adrian looked toward the house. "She offered to, but she stayed." "Yes." Wallace folded his hands calmly. "Sometimes people stay because they need the job." Adrian didn't respond. "And sometimes," Wallace continued carefully, "they stay because something unfinished brought them there." Adrian glanced at him. "You think she came here looking for me?" "I don't know." Adrian took another sip of coffee and looked out across the garden again. "I asked her if she knew whose house this was. And? She said she didn't." Wallace nodded thoughtfully. "Did you believe her?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. "I don't know." The truth was more complicated than that. When Nina had said the words earlier, her voice had sounded honest. But honesty didn't always mean the whole story. Inside the house, a clock chimed faintly somewhere down the hallway. It was nearly 1. Wallace cleared his throat gently. "Lunch is ready." Adrian nodded. "Tell her." Wallace went back inside. Adrian remained on the terrace for another minute before following. The dining room of the Russo estate was large enough for formal gatherings, though most days it held only 1 or 2 people. A long wooden table stretched across the center of the room, and sunlight from the tall windows fell across neatly arranged plates. When Adrian entered, Nina was standing near the far side of the table. She had washed her hands and tied her hair back slightly, trying to look as professional as possible. Mr. Wallace had invited her to eat something before continuing work, though she clearly felt uncomfortable sitting at the same table as the owner of the house. "Sit," Adrian said calmly as he walked in. Nina hesitated. "It's all right." She slowly pulled out a chair near the end of the table. Wallace set down 2 plates of simple food, grilled chicken, vegetables, and bread. Adrian sat at the head of the table. For a moment the room was quiet except for the faint sound of silverware. Nina kept her eyes mostly on her plate. Adrian studied her briefly. "You cook?" he asked. Nina looked up. "Sometimes." "For your son?" "Yes." "What does he like to eat?" "Anything with pasta." Adrian nodded faintly. "Kids usually do." A small silence followed. Then he asked another question. "Does he know you're working here?" Nina shook her head. "He just knows I started a new job." "Does he ask questions?" "Sometimes." "What do you tell him?" Nina paused before answering. "That his mother works hard." Adrian's expression softened slightly. "That sounds accurate." Wallace quietly refilled their glasses with water, and stepped away again. Adrian looked at Nina across the table. You said earlier you manage everything yourself. Yes, that can't be easy. It isn't, but you're doing it. Yes. Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair. You always were stubborn. Nina gave a faint smile. You used to call it determination? I probably still would. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away. After lunch, Nina stood first. I should get back to work. Adrian nodded. There are a few rooms upstairs Wallace can show you. All right. She picked up her plate to carry it toward the kitchen. Adrian watched her go. When she disappeared down the hallway, Wallace returned quietly. You're thinking again, Wallace said. Adrian looked down at the table. Yes. Wallace waited. Adrian spoke quietly. 8 years. Wallace said nothing. Adrian rubbed his temples slowly. If my memory is right. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since Nina Walker had walked back into his life that morning, Adrian Russo had begun asking himself a question that made him deeply uneasy. What if the past had returned with more than just memories, and somewhere upstairs in the quiet house? Nina Walker continued cleaning the rooms of the man who had once broken her heart, unaware that the questions forming in Adrian's mind were only beginning to unfold. The afternoon inside the Russo estate settled into a quieter rhythm after lunch. Nina followed Mr. Wallace up the wide staircase to the second floor, carrying the small basket of cleaning supplies he had handed her. The hallway upstairs stretched across the length of the house, lined with closed doors and tall windows that overlooked the gardens below. This floor is mostly guest rooms, Wallace explained as they walked. They're rarely used, but Mr. Russo prefers everything kept in order. I understand, Nina replied. Wallace stopped in front of the first door and opened it. Inside was a large bedroom decorated in neutral colors, the kind of space designed more for comfort than personality. Nina stepped inside and immediately began noticing small details that needed attention. Dust along the window frame, faint fingerprints on the dresser mirror. You work quietly, Wallace said from the doorway. I try to. He nodded approvingly. Some people talk while they work. I prefer to finish the job faster. Wallace gave a faint smile. That's a good habit. He left her to continue the work. Nina opened the window slightly to let fresh air into the room. Outside, the breeze carried the distant sound of traffic far beyond the estate walls. The quiet here felt different from the apartment she shared with Lucas in Queens. There, noise was constant, neighbors arguing, children running down the hallway, the rumble of subway trains passing under the streets. This house had space, too much space. As she wiped the dresser carefully, her thoughts drifted again to Adrian. Seeing him earlier had stirred memories she had tried not to revisit. The young man she had once known was still there somewhere behind the colder expression he wore now. But he had changed. The way people moved around him in the house made that clear. Even Mr. Wallace spoke to him with the careful respect of someone who understood exactly how much authority Adrian carried. Nina had heard rumors about the Russo family years ago, long after Adrian disappeared from her life. Newspapers sometimes mentioned the name in connection with construction unions and business investigations. She had never followed those stories closely. Part of her had simply chosen not to look. A faint knock interrupted her thoughts. Wallace stood in the doorway again. Everything all right? Yes. He glanced around the room. You're making good progress. Thank you. Wallace leaned slightly against the doorframe. You have experience with this kind of work. Some. Where? Hotels mostly. That explains the attention to detail. Nina continued wiping the mirror. Wallace watched quietly for a moment before speaking again. You didn't seem surprised when you saw Mr. Russo earlier. Nina paused, then resumed cleaning. I was surprised. Wallace tilted his head slightly. You knew him before? Yes. From where? Nina considered the question. A long time ago. Wallace sensed the conversation reaching a boundary and did not push further. Well, he said gently, if you need anything while you're working, just let me know. All right. After he left, Nina finished the room quickly and moved on to the next. Meanwhile, downstairs, Adrian sat in his office staring at a document he had already read 3 times. The words no longer made sense. His mind kept returning to the same place. 8 years. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temple. On the desk sat a photograph from years earlier, one taken during a construction project opening. Adrian stood beside 2 business partners, smiling in a way he rarely did now. He looked younger in that picture, less guarded. The office door opened quietly. One of his security men stepped inside. "Mr. Russo?" Adrian looked up. "What is it?" Mr. Caruso called. "He wants to confirm tomorrow's meeting at the port." Adrian nodded. "Tell him 10 in the morning." "Yes, sir." The man hesitated before leaving. "Something else?" Adrian asked. "No, sir." The door closed again. Adrian leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Work usually cleared his thoughts. Today it did the opposite. He stood up and walked toward the window. From his office he could see the second-floor windows of the guest wing. One of them was open now. Nina must have opened it while cleaning. He watched the curtain move slightly in the breeze. Without fully deciding to do it, Adrian left the office and walked upstairs. The hallway was quiet when he reached the guest rooms. He followed the faint sound of movement until he found Nina in the second room down the corridor. She was standing on the small ladder again, wiping dust from the top of a wardrobe. She hadn't noticed him yet. Adrian leaned lightly against the doorframe. "You're going to fall if you keep reaching like that." Nina turned quickly. "Oh." She stepped down from the ladder. "I'm fine." Adrian glanced around the room. "You've already finished the first one." "Yes." "You work quickly." "I told you I try to." He nodded. For a moment he didn't say anything else. Nina picked up the cloth again. "I'll finish this room soon." Adrian crossed his arms. "You don't have to rush." "I'm not rushing." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Does your son stay nearby after school?" Nina looked at him carefully. "My neighbor watches him." "Every day?" "Most days." Adrian nodded slowly. "That's helpful." "It is." Another pause. "You said his name is Lucas." "Yes." "How old did you say he was?" 8. Adrian leaned slightly against the doorframe again. "What grade is he in?" "Third." "Does he like it?" "Some days." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds familiar." Nina continued cleaning the wardrobe. "You ask a lot of questions." Adrian shrugged slightly. "I like to know the people working in my house." She glanced at him briefly. "That's reasonable." Adrian watched her for another moment before pushing himself away from the door. "Don't stay up here too late," he said. "You'll need energy tomorrow." Nina nodded. "All right." Adrian walked back down the hallway, but as he descended the staircase again, the same thought returned to him. 8 years. The number refused to leave his mind, and for the first time since Nina Walker had walked back into his life that morning, Adrian Russo began to realize that the questions forming in his head might soon require answers he wasn't prepared to hear. The sun had begun to sink lower by the time Nina finished the last guest room on the second floor. Soft golden light filled the hallway through the tall windows, and the quiet inside the house felt almost peaceful now. She placed the cleaning supplies back into the basket and took a slow breath. It had been a long first day, longer than she expected, not because of the work, but because every step inside this house carried a memory she hadn't planned to face again. Adrian Russo. Just saying the name in her mind still felt strange. 10 years ago, she had imagined a completely different life with him. A small apartment, maybe. A shared future. Something simple and ordinary. Instead, fate had taken them down very different paths. Now she was working in his house. Nina shook the thought away and walked downstairs with the basket. Mr. Wallace was in the kitchen again, arranging dishes neatly along the counter. "You've finished upstairs already?" he asked. "Yes." That was quick. There wasn't much to clean. Wallace nodded. "You work harder than most people who come through here. I try to do things properly." Wallace poured a glass of water and handed it to her. "You should rest a moment before heading home." "Thank you." Nina drank the water slowly. Her feet ached slightly, but it was the kind of tired she was used to. "Do you leave around this time every day?" Wallace asked. "If the work is done." Wallace glanced toward the hallway. "Mr. Russo is still in his office." Nina nodded politely but said nothing. The idea of crossing paths with Adrian again before leaving made her uneasy. Wallace studied her expression carefully. "You knew him a long time ago," he said quietly. Nina looked down at the glass in her hands. "Yes." "Friends?" The word lingered in the air. "Something like that." Wallace did not ask further questions. Instead, he spoke gently. "Life can be strange sometimes." "Yes," Nina replied softly. At that moment, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Adrian entered the kitchen. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled the sleeves of his white shirt slightly. The look made him appear less like the intimidating businessman people feared, and more like the man Nina once knew. For a brief second their eyes met. Then Adrian looked at Wallace. "Is she finished for the day?" "Yes, sir." Adrian nodded once. Nina placed the empty glass on the counter. "I'll be leaving now." Adrian glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's late. I need to get back before my son gets home." The words came naturally, but Adrian noticed them immediately. "Your neighbor watches him until evening, right?" "Yes." Adrian walked to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water. "How long does it take you to get home?" "About 40 minutes. By train?" "Yes." Adrian leaned against the counter slightly. "You do that every day?" "Yes." "You must be tired by the time you get home." Nina gave a small shrug. "It's part of life." Adrian studied her face quietly. "And your son? What about him? Does he ask where you work?" "Sometimes." "What do you tell him?" "That his mother has a job." Adrian nodded slowly. "That's fair." Silence settled again. Wallace quietly began washing dishes, giving the two of them space without leaving the room. Adrian took a sip of water before asking another question. "Does Lucas ever come into the city?" "Sometimes on weekends." "What does he like to do?" Nina smiled faintly. "Parks, pizza, anything that lets him run around." Adrian's expression softened slightly. "Sounds like a normal kid." "He is." Adrian set the bottle down. 8 is a good age." Nina nodded. "Yes." There was a brief pause before Adrian spoke again. "Does he look like you?" The question caught Nina off guard. "Some people say he does." Adrian watched her closely. "And the father?" Nina's expression remained calm. "He's not around." Adrian nodded once. "I see." Wallace turned off the faucet behind them. "I'll prepare the front gate for your exit," he said to Nina. "Thank you." Wallace left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hall. Adrian and Nina stood alone. For a moment neither spoke. Finally, Adrian said quietly, "You've managed well." Nina looked at him. "With what?" "Life." She gave a small smile. "You learn to." Adrian leaned slightly against the counter. "I suppose you do." Nina picked up her bag from the chair near the door. "I should go." Adrian nodded. "Yes." She started toward the hallway, but Adrian spoke again before she reached the door. "Nina." She stopped. "Yes?" He hesitated for just a moment. "Be careful on the train." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper. "I will." She walked down the hallway toward the front door. Adrian remained standing in the kitchen. A few seconds later, Wallace returned. "She's leaving now," Wallace said. Adrian nodded. Through the kitchen window, he could see the driveway leading toward the gates of the estate. A few minutes later, Nina appeared outside, walking down the path toward the security gate. Her figure grew smaller as she moved farther away. Wallace glanced at Adrian. "You're thinking again." Adrian didn't deny it. "Yes." Wallace folded his arms. "About the boy?" Adrian looked toward the gate where Nina had just disappeared. "Yes." Wallace spoke carefully. "You could ask her directly." Adrian shook his head. "No." "Why not?" Adrian's eyes remained fixed on the empty driveway. "Because some answers change everything." Wallace studied him quietly. "And you're not ready for that?" Adrian finally turned away from the window. "I don't even know if the question is real yet." The house fell silent again. But as evening settled over the Russo estate, one thought continued to move through Adrian Russo's mind. 8 years old, Lucas, and the quiet suspicion that the past had returned to his life carrying a truth he might not be able to ignore much longer. Night settled slowly over the Russo estate. The tall trees surrounding the property moved gently in the evening wind, their shadows stretching across the quiet garden. Inside the house, most of the lights had been dimmed. The kitchen was clean, the dining room empty, and the long hallways carried the calm silence that Adrian Russo usually preferred. But that night the silence did not bring him peace. Adrian sat alone in his office with a glass of whiskey resting untouched on the desk. Papers from earlier meetings were spread in front of him, yet he had not read a single line for the past half hour. His mind had returned again and again to the same thought. 8 years. Lucas. He leaned back slowly in his chair and stared at the ceiling. 10 years earlier, he had walked away from Nina Walker because his family demanded it. His father had made the choice clear. If Adrian wanted to remain part of the Russo organization, he would end the relationship immediately. Family first, emotion second, weakness never. Adrian had obeyed. At the time, he believed it was the only decision possible. He told himself Nina would move on. She would find someone else, build a life somewhere far from the dangerous world he lived in. He had never imagined she might be carrying a part of him with her when he left. Adrian stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the security lights along the driveway illuminated the empty path leading toward the gate. Somewhere beyond those trees, Nina was probably already home with her son. Lucas. Adrian rubbed his jaw slowly. A quiet knock came from the door. "Come in." Wallace stepped inside. "You're still awake," the older man said. Adrian gave a small shrug. "I had work." Wallace glanced at the untouched whiskey. "You usually drink that when you're thinking." Adrian looked down at the glass. "I suppose I am." Wallace closed the door behind him. "The house is locked up for the night." "Good." For a moment neither man spoke. Then Wallace said quietly, "You're still thinking about what we discussed earlier?" "Yes." Wallace walked slowly across the room and stopped near the desk. "There's something you should understand about people who carry responsibility for a long time." Adrian looked at him. "What's that?" "They often assume they control everything." Adrian gave a faint smile. "That sounds like something you'd accuse me of." "I'm not accusing you." Wallace's voice remained calm. "I'm reminding you that life rarely follows the plans we create for it." Adrian sat down again. "Are you suggesting something?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes the past returns because it was never finished." Adrian sighed quietly. "You really believe that boy could be mine?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Wallace folded his hands behind his back. "I only said the timing caught your attention." Adrian leaned back in the chair again. "Yes, and that's enough to make you uneasy." Adrian stared at the desk for a moment. 8 years. "Yes. I remember exactly when I left." Wallace nodded slowly. "And you've done the math." Adrian didn't respond. The silence confirmed the answer. After a moment, Wallace spoke again. "Why not ask her?" Adrian shook his head immediately. "No." "Why?" Adrian stood and walked back toward the window. "Because if I ask that question and the answer is yes, everything changes." Wallace studied him carefully. "And if the answer is no?" Adrian turned back toward him. "Then I look like a fool." Wallace gave a small smile. "Pride has never been your strongest weakness." Adrian laughed quietly. "No, but it's still there." The older man nodded. "That's true." Another silence settled over the room. Then Adrian said something he had not admitted aloud before. "I keep thinking about the way she answered." "What do you mean?" "When I asked about the father," Wallace waited. "She didn't hesitate," Adrian said. "She simply said he's not around." Wallace considered that. "That could mean many things." "Yes." Adrian rubbed his temples slowly. "I've spent years reading people in business meetings, watching their faces when they lie, listening to the tone of their voice when they hide something. And I couldn't read her." Wallace nodded. "That may be because you knew her before." Adrian looked at him. "Or because she's telling the truth." "Perhaps." Adrian walked back to the desk and finally picked up the whiskey glass. He took a slow sip. The burn of the drink settled in his chest. "You know something strange?" he said quietly. "What?" "I didn't ask her again if she knew whose house this was." Wallace tilted his head. "Why not?" Adrian looked down at the glass. "I think part of me didn't want the answer." Wallace gave a thoughtful nod. "That's honest." Adrian placed the glass back on the desk. Outside the window, the wind moved through the trees again. After a moment, Wallace spoke. "She'll be back tomorrow." Adrian nodded. "Yes. And eventually," Wallace continued, "you'll either ask the question or stop thinking about it." Adrian smiled faintly. "I doubt I'll stop thinking about it." Wallace turned toward the door. "Then perhaps tomorrow will bring some clarity." Before leaving, he added one more thought. "Whatever the truth is, Mr. Russo, you've faced harder things than a conversation." Adrian watched him leave. The office returned to silence again. Adrian walked slowly to the window one last time. The driveway lights stretched across the empty path leading toward the gate. Somewhere in the city, Nina Walker was probably sitting at a small kitchen table with her son, helping him with homework or preparing dinner. A life far removed from the world Adrian Russo controlled. Yet somehow their lives had crossed again. And as Adrian stood there in the quiet darkness of the estate, he began to realize something he had not allowed himself to admit before. Tomorrow might bring more than just another day of work. It might bring the truth. Morning arrived quietly over Long Island. A pale gray light stretched across the sky as the sun slowly rose behind the tall trees surrounding the Russo estate. The house was already awake. Security guards rotated shifts near the gate, and somewhere in the kitchen the faint smell of coffee drifted into the hallways. Adrian Russo had slept very little. He had remained in his office long after midnight, reviewing contracts and financial reports, but the numbers on the pages had done little to quiet his mind. By the time he finally went to bed, the sky had already begun to lighten. Now he stood in the kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, staring out the window toward the long driveway that curved toward the iron gates. He didn't know exactly why he was watching the entrance, but he knew who he expected to see. Mr. Wallace entered the kitchen carrying a small stack of folded newspapers. "You're up early," Wallace said. Adrian gave a small shrug. "Couldn't sleep." Wallace placed the papers neatly on the counter. "That happens sometimes." Adrian nodded. "Is she coming today?" he asked casually. Wallace raised an eyebrow. "She works here now." "I would assume so." Adrian took a slow sip of coffee. "What time does she usually arrive?" "Around 8. Adrian glanced at the clock. It was 7:45. The two men stood quietly for a moment. Outside, a black sedan passed along the distant road beyond the estate walls. Birds moved through the trees near the garden fountain. Then the gate camera monitor beside the kitchen door flickered slightly. A figure appeared walking through the security entrance. Wallace glanced at the screen. That would be her. Adrian didn't look immediately. He took another sip of coffee first. Then he turned toward the monitor. Nina Walker stepped through the gate wearing the same simple coat she had worn the day before. Her hair was pulled back, and she carried a small bag over one shoulder. She spoke briefly with the guard before walking up the long driveway toward the house. Adrian watched silently. "Right on time," Wallace said. Adrian nodded. "Yes." A few minutes later, the front door opened quietly. Nina stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The large entry hall felt almost echoing in the morning stillness. She removed her coat and hung it neatly near the door before walking toward the kitchen. Wallace greeted her first. "Good morning." "Good morning." Nina noticed Adrian standing near the window and paused slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Russo." Adrian turned toward her. "Morning." Her voice sounded calm, almost too calm. Adrian studied her briefly. "You made it here early." The train wasn't crowded today. Wallace poured her a cup of coffee. "You should have some before starting." "Thank you." Nina wrapped her hands around the warm cup for a moment. Adrian leaned lightly against the counter. "Did Lucas get to school all right?" Nina looked up slightly. "Yes." "He takes the bus?" "Most days." Adrian nodded. "And today?" "My neighbor walked him to school." Adrian considered that for a moment. "You trust her?" "Yes." Wallace glanced between them quietly. Adrian asked another question. "Does Lucas like school?" "Some subjects." "Which ones?" "Science." Adrian allowed himself a faint smile. "That was my favorite subject when I was his age." Nina seemed slightly surprised by the comment. "Really?" "Yes." "What happened?" Adrian shrugged. "Life." The small moment of humor faded quickly. Nina set the cup down. "I should start working." Wallace nodded. "The upstairs hallway still needs attention." Nina picked up the cleaning basket and turned toward the stairs. Adrian watched her go. When she reached the middle of the staircase, he spoke again. "Nina." She stopped and looked down at him. "Yes?" Adrian hesitated briefly. "Does Lucas ever visit Long Island?" She seemed confused. "No." "Why not?" "We've never had a reason to." Adrian nodded slowly. "All right." Nina continued upstairs. Wallace remained standing near the counter. "You're getting closer to the question," he said quietly. Adrian didn't look at him. "I'm not asking it today." Wallace smiled faintly. "You already are." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Not directly." Wallace leaned against the counter. Indirect questions still lead somewhere. Adrian glanced toward the staircase where Nina had disappeared. "Yes." Upstairs, Nina began cleaning the hallway windows. The morning sun had risen fully now, sending bright light across the polished floors. She worked quietly, but her thoughts drifted again to the conversation downstairs. Adrian had asked about Lucas several times now, more than once. That wasn't casual curiosity. It was something else. Nina wiped the glass carefully, watching the garden through the window. She knew the moment would eventually come. The moment Adrian Russo would ask the question he had avoided so far. When that happened, everything would change. Downstairs in the kitchen, Adrian finished his coffee. He stared at the empty cup for a moment. 8 years. The number returned again, but this time it felt heavier. And somewhere upstairs, Nina Walker continued cleaning the windows of the house, aware that the past she and Adrian shared was slowly moving toward a conversation neither of them could avoid much longer. The morning passed slowly inside the Russo estate. Upstairs, Nina continued working along the hallway windows. The sunlight had grown brighter now, warming the wooden floors and casting long reflections across the polished glass. She moved methodically from one window to the next, wiping the frames and cleaning the handles the way she had learned to do in hotels years earlier. The work helped her keep her thoughts steady, but even as she focused on each small task, she could feel something shifting inside the house. Adrian Russo was asking more questions. Careful ones, indirect ones, but questions nonetheless. Nina paused for a moment at the end of the hallway and looked out across the wide lawn beyond the estate. From this height, she could see the long driveway curving toward the gate where she had entered earlier that morning. For a brief second, she imagined Lucas running across that open grass, chasing a soccer ball or laughing the way he did in the park near their apartment. The thought made her smile faintly. Then she picked up the cloth again and continued working. Downstairs, Adrian sat in his office with a file open on his desk. The pages contained shipping schedules and port contracts, but he hadn't read more than a few lines. His mind was elsewhere again. He remembered Nina's voice when she spoke about Lucas. Calm, steady, almost protective. Adrian leaned back in his chair and looked toward the photograph sitting near the corner of the desk. It showed him years ago standing beside two men during the opening of a construction site. He barely recognized the person in the picture anymore. Younger, less careful. Back then, life had felt simpler. Now, every decision carried weight. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Wallace stepped inside. "Mr. Russo," the accountant called, "about the quarterly report." Adrian nodded. "Tell him I'll review it this afternoon." "Yes, sir." Wallace hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "She's still upstairs." "I know." Wallace studied him quietly. "You're thinking about the same thing again." Adrian gave a small smile. "You're very observant. That's part of my job." Adrian closed the file slowly. "I almost asked her this morning." Wallace raised an eyebrow. "What stopped you?" Adrian stood and walked toward the window. "Timing." Wallace waited. Adrian continued quietly. "Some questions change the direction of a person's life." "That's true. And once the answer is spoken," Adrian said, "you can't pretend you didn't hear it." Wallace nodded thoughtfully. "That's also true." Adrian looked out across the garden. "Part of me still hopes the answer is simple." "And the other part?" Adrian didn't answer. He didn't need to. After a moment, Wallace spoke again. "Lunch will be ready soon." Adrian nodded. "All right." Upstairs, Nina finished cleaning the last window in the hallway and stepped down from the ladder. She gathered the cloths and placed them neatly into the basket before carrying it toward the staircase. As she descended, she could hear voices faintly coming from Adrian's office. She didn't stop to listen. It wasn't her place. Instead, she walked quietly toward the kitchen. Wallace noticed her first. "You've finished already?" "Yes." "Good work." Nina placed the basket on the counter. Adrian entered the kitchen a moment later. For a second, the three of them stood in silence. Then Adrian spoke. "You move quickly." "I try to stay efficient." He nodded. "That's clear." Wallace began setting plates on the table again. "Lunch is ready." They sat in the dining room the same way they had the day before. Adrian at the head of the table, Nina near the end. The meal was simple soup, bread, and a small salad. For a few minutes, the only sounds in the room were the quiet movements of silverware. Then Adrian spoke. "Lucas is in 3rd grade, right?" Nina looked up. "Yes." "What does he want to be when he grows up?" She smiled faintly. "Yesterday he said an astronaut." Adrian chuckled softly. "That's ambitious. He changes his mind every week." "That's normal." Another pause followed. Then Adrian asked, "Does he ask about his father?" Nina's hand paused briefly on the edge of the table. "Sometimes." "What do you tell him?" "The truth." Adrian watched her carefully. "And what is that?" "That his father isn't part of our lives." The words were calm, but firm. Adrian nodded slowly. "I see." Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Nina stood. "I should get back to work." Adrian didn't stop her. She carried her plate toward the kitchen and disappeared down the hallway. Wallace remained seated for a moment longer before gathering the remaining dishes. Adrian leaned back in his chair. "What are you thinking?" Wallace asked. Adrian looked toward the hallway where Nina had gone. "I think the question is getting closer." Wallace nodded. "Yes." Adrian rubbed his temple slowly. "But I'm not ready to ask it yet." "Why?" Adrian answered quietly. "Because once I do, there's no going back." Wallace considered that. That may already be true. Adrian didn't respond. Outside the dining room window, the wind moved gently through the trees again. Upstairs, Nina walked toward the next room that needed cleaning, unaware that the conversation downstairs had brought Adrian one step closer to the truth he had been avoiding since the moment she walked back into his house. And deep inside Adrian Russo's mind, the same thought continued to grow stronger with every passing hour. 8 years, Lucas, and the quiet fear that the life he had built so carefully might soon collide with the one he had left behind. This story reminds us that the past never truly disappears. The choices we make, especially the ones made out of fear or pressure, can shape lives far beyond what we imagine. Time may move forward, but truth has a way of returning when we least expect it. The story also shows the quiet strength of responsibility. Nina chose to move forward with dignity, raising her child and building a life without bitterness. In the end, the real lesson is that courage is not only about power or success, but about facing the consequences of our past and choosing to do what is right when the truth finally stands in front of us. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,